That's kind of a subsidiarity argument. He says, the former without the latter gives way to social privatism. And he goes on to say, while the latter, which is solidarity without the former, gives way to paternalist social assistance, which is demeaning to those in need. So now we have four areas of principle, all very complicated in themselves. The human person, justice and charity, the common good, and subsidiarity and solidarity. It's in light of these four principles of Catholic social teaching the Pope follows and then develops four lines of social analysis and theological reflection about human development in the world today. First, the attention to individuals and to structures or systems. The Pope emphasizes first, this would be the individual part, the responsible freedom of individuals and peoples that is important and integral to human development. No social structure, he writes, can guarantee development without such freedom. At the same time, the Pope acknowledges the importance of economic and social institutions and structures. We see this duality, for example, in the letter. He has a big discussion about world hunger. He starts on the human side, the individual side, by saying this: the peoples in hunger are making a dramatic appeal to peoples blessed with abundance. So this is his individual emphasis. It has to touch the hearts and minds of other people. But then in further discussion of hunger in the letter, he goes on to shift to the structural and emphasizes at least 5 points. 1, the need for a network of economic institutions capable of guaranteeing regular access to sufficient food and water. 2, eliminating the structural causes of food security in the world. 3, promoting the agricultural development of poorer countries. 4, involvement of local communities in choices and decisions. And 5, the necessity to, quote, cultivate a public conscience that considers food and access to water as universal rights of all human beings without distinction or discrimination. Third area, interdependence. The Church has talked about a multiplication of social relationships for about 50 years now. And the Pope goes on to say this has become even more intense in a world which is progressively and pervasively globalized. And then he writes, the risk for our time is that the de facto interdependence of peoples and nations is not matched by ethical interaction of consciences and minds that would give rise to truly human development. He says mere technical progress and utilitarian relationships, as in the marketplace, they cannot guarantee the sharing of goods and resources that are basic to authentic human development. This can only be accomplished, he says, by love which overcomes evil with good. Then the third area, 3 sectors. Benedict follows his predecessor, Pope John Paul II, in talking about the need of every society to have 3 vibrant sectors: the market, the state, and civil society. I want to talk about the 3 quickly and then talk about a blending that he talks about in terms of new trends. First, the market. The Pope affirms the importance of the economic marketplace as the institution that permits persons, inasmuch as they are economic subjects, to use contracts to regulate their relations as they exchange goods and services to satisfy their needs and desires. I enter into a contract every time I go to the supermarket and buy something. That's what he's talking about. And economic life requires contracts, he writes. And this is a point where a traditional principle of commutative justice applies to contracts, which is fairness in contracting with one another. But he notes the social doctrine of the Church has unceasingly highlighted the importance of distributive justice and social justice for the market economy. He also makes it clear that at various points in a globalized society, it is access to international and other markets that is most needed by poor and by underdeveloped nations. The second sector he talks about is the state, government. Political authority, which he says must be dispersed and effective on different levels, including the international. It is the political community, he says, which has responsibility for directing economic activity toward the common good. Grave imbalances are produced, he writes, when economic action conceived merely as an engine for wealth creation is detached from political action, conceived as a means for pursuing justice through redistribution. The Pope concedes that nation-states now have far more limited sovereignty in the context of international trade and commerce. This has altered, he says, the political power of states, and it calls for a reevaluation of the role of states. But then he counters that thought and he says, rather than being, quote, too precipitous in declaring the demise of the state, he suggests that the current world economic crisis will bring the nation-state's role, will be more destined to grow, he said, in working towards resolution of this crisis. Third sector, civil society. This is a sector that we in this country call often voluntary sector or the non-profit sector. And Benedict's in continuity with his predecessors in emphasizing the importance of civil society, which Pope John Paul II saw as the most natural setting for an economy of gratuitousness and fraternity. This emphasis is also consistent with the principle of subsidiarity. And it's thought that this sector, civil society, is very important in Catholic social thought to offset the absorbing tendencies of centralizing governments, as in fascism or communism. But civil society and its organizations and activities have also been important, the tradition holds, in cushioning the worst aspects of the free market. And so for Benedict, this sector is essential to preserving important aspects of human society and promoting integral human development. In his words, he writes this: when both the logic of the market and the logic of the state come to an agreement that each will continue to exercise a monopoly over its own respective area of influence, in the long term, much is lost. Solidarity in relations between citizens, participation and adherence, actions of gratuitousness, all of which stand in contrast to giving in order to acquire, which is the logic of exchange, the market, and giving through duty, which he said is the logic of public obligation imposed by law. So for the Church and for Benedict, civil society is seen as a counterpose to both the government and the state, have an important balance between the two. But then he moves into a whole new area where he blends the market and civil society. And it's in keeping with his theme about love and gift and gratuitousness. Because he says, he writes, the human being is made for gift, which expresses and makes present his transcendent dimension. We might say that it is in giving that we are most like God, loving freely, loving without thought of reward. And in terms of economic and social and political development, the Pope writes that all development must make room for the principle of gratuitousness as an expression of human fraternity. He first describes this mutual trust between human beings as essential even in the operation of the market itself. Without solidarity and trust, the Pope writes, as the current economic market crisis attests, the market cannot completely fulfill its proper economic function. So he starts his line of reasoning by emphasizing that virtuous behavior is essential even in the economic marketplace. Commercial logic, he said, alone cannot solve social problems. And grave imbalances are produced in society locally and worldwide when economic action conceived of solely for wealth creation is separated from political action that should pursue justice. The market, he continues, is neither ethically neutral nor inherently inhuman. But as human activity, it must be structured and governed in an ethical manner. Thus begins the traditional social ethics, Catholic social ethics in the marketplace, the importance of things like transparency and honesty and responsibility, which we saw a great lack of in the crisis we have been in the midst of. In addition, the Pope writes, the Church's social doctrine has always maintained that justice has to be applied to every phase of economic activity, and every economic decision has a moral consequence. What's most novel, though, in the encyclical I found is the introduction of new forms of commercial entities, to use his language, based on mutualist principles and pursuing social ends. As examples, he cites the exchange now of and sharing and shifting and overlap of competencies between the for-profit world and the non-profit world. He sees this, for example, in the ethical investor movement, or in microcredit programs, or in microfinance, which are all areas where he argues that ethics and the economy are blending together. But he breaks the most new ground in his discussion when he endorses a broad intermediate area which has more recently emerged, I'd say in recent decades, between profit-based companies and non-profit organizations.